Welcome to Creation and Conflict podcast, where our goal is to turn confrontation into conversation. Tonight's special guest is Mike Beidler. He's an old friend of mine online. We disagree on a few things, but it's the way that we've disagreed over the years that has kept me coming back to him for dialogue. He is a great example of how one can carry on conversation in topics that are often confrontational. And he's helped me a great deal over the last decade in understanding what theistic evolution really is and what it isn't. And I'm still not fully on board with his position, but we still don't break fellowship over that. Tonight, he's going to be talking about the interpretations of Genesis that have become a little bit more popular lately in the areas of it being a functional ontology as well as it being a cosmic temple story. Mike, among many other things, is the current president of the DC Metro section of the American Scientific Affiliation, which is one of the oldest organizations for Christians in the sciences. And in that role, he has been able to do lectures at the Smithsonian Institute. He's been able to do lectures at different church events and stuff, exploring the whole topic of science and faith and how you can have a solid faith and still trust the sciences. In that context, I want to start out with our introductory quote that we normally start with. In this case, it's a quote from Jonathan Edwards. He said, "All truth is given by revelation, either general or special, and it must be received by reason. Reason is the God-given means for discovering the truth that God discloses, whether in his world or his word. While God wants to reach the heart with truth, he does not bypass the mind." And that's the context in which I really appreciate Mike. He's very sharp-minded and has edited a lot of books, theology as well as Christian fiction books, and knows a lot about the topic that we're going to be getting into tonight. So, Mike, why don't we jump right into functional ontology and teleology with you explaining the differences between the two and the relationship between the two.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your podcast, Daniel. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure dialoguing with you over the years, and I would have to say it's probably been about 10 years.
It's been 10 years.
Yeah, but to your point, you wanted to discuss the concept of ontology and teleology, and trying to keep things at a fairly basic level. Ontology is kind of the study of what exists and how it exists. And different cultures can have different ontologies. And when we're looking at what exists and how it exists from a modern scientific Enlightenment influenced worldview, we've got the Big Bang from 13.78 billion years ago. And how it exists, we could, describe, how that unfolded over that period of time. But what the modern ontology doesn't deal with is why it exists.
Right.
And, we know how it exists from a certain point in time, very close to the Big Bang. But, what happened before that, if there was such a thing as a before. And that's kind of where teleology comes into play. But to go back to ontology, in the ancient Near East, the various cultures, Egypt, Israel, Babylon, Sumer, all had different ontologies. So we can read in some of John Walton's work about how the Egyptians understood the universe, and that things that had a material existence from our perspective didn't have an existence in theirs. They could touch it, they could smell it, they could taste it, but if it didn't have purpose, and this is kind of where teleology comes in, if it didn't have an apparent purpose, then it was useless and not worthy of consideration. And of course, the various cultures would have different spins on that particular point. And of course, the ancient Hebrew version kind of turns that on its head, and we can get into that later. But every ontology, every culture will have a different flavor of ontology. So it's not a hard science. It really is a philosophical construct. It's a metaphysic.
Right.
And teleology is really the kind of the study of purpose. It's a subdiscipline of metaphysics. And so it studies purpose and the design of things that already are in existence. And whether it exists in the Egyptian mindset or it exists in ours, there will tend to be teleology involved. So our biblical ontology that we get from the Judeo-Christian tradition, God is the reason why things exist. He created time, space, matter, and the teleology explains then how he's involved in this process, in these processes. And so he is a being that has taken great pains to create this universe using natural laws to bring about what we see today. And that includes, that's cosmological, that's geological evolution. It could be a biological evolution. So, from my viewpoint, God, the creator, has this foresight, you could say, to create a world that can self-assemble according to natural laws. And this is definitely not a deistic worldview. It's not that he, wound the clock and let it go. He is constantly undergirding those natural processes and upholding them and sustaining them by the word of his power.
Yeah, there's a verse that talks about that. It's often quoted in the context of how the earth is fallen and corrupted now, but it talks about how the earth is groaning. And what it goes on to say is it's groaning as in child pains. It's still giving birth. And, when I look at creation and I look at, every spring when the leaves come out and everything, it's like God is still involved in creating. Mm-hmm. And, it's not a deistic hands-off view at all. He may be using certain patterns of weather and seasons and all that kind of stuff, but he calls those things too. He's using tools that he created to do things. That doesn't take away anything from him to understand that.
You're absolutely right, Daniel. And some people ask me, what I believe about miracles and God's role in miracles, and I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, a miracle is not just something that God does that intervenes in the natural order of things for a particular purpose.
Right.
I think every moment is a miracle, because without God undergirding and sustaining everything constantly, without that divine intervention, everything would just spin into nothingness.
Right.
The cosmos would cease to exist. And I think that things exist, that God created everything and has a purpose for what he's created. It kind of makes evolutionary creationism a very, I think, holistic look that both I think successfully synthesizes biblical faith, Christian faith, with the findings of modern science.
Right. You mentioned John Walton. When I first heard of John Walton, it was basically about the same time you and I met in another, Christian site many years ago that's now long gone. But someone had mentioned that the only reason I held my view or had said the things that I had said about Genesis 1 was because I'd been influenced by John Walton. I had no idea who John Walton was. I know you've met him a few times. I'm kind of jealous, but I noticed this whole idea of Genesis 1 being functional when I noticed all the prepositional phrases in the account. Right. And when you go through and you start highlighting all the prepositional phrases, it's a little over 25% of the account is prepositional phrases. And if you look at it as if you were trying to diagram sentences on each of these days, it's not just God made, the sun, or God made the great light or whatever. It's that he made it to do certain things. He made animals to reproduce after their kinds. He made things for certain reasons. And it's this whole purpose and function behind it that doesn't take away from the fact that the New Testament tells us that Christ is responsible for creation and made all things from nothing. So we're not saying that God didn't make those things, but when we look at the Genesis 1 account, it's more telling us why these things are here. And that makes sense if it's a revelation to a people whose ontology is functional. You're trying to explain to them the difference or the new revelation being the real purpose behind these things, as opposed to what surrounding cultures may have believed about why certain things existed.
Yeah, I agree. And, your take on noticing the prepositional phrases in Genesis 1, I had never heard that before, but now that you mention it, it's very obvious.
Right.
And I think Genesis 1 is a perfect example of teleology, regardless of how you view Genesis 1.
Right.
The teleology is just, exuding out of this chapter. As a young earth creationist, I think the teleology would pretty much be the same, that God created everything for his glory and to reflect himself.
Right.
And that everything that he does, whether it's in the initial creative act or the ongoing activity of creation, it's really for him. And, I think that's where young earth creationists and evolutionary creationists can, sit side by side and, praise the creator God together.
Right. We can, it doesn't attack young earth creationism to point out that Genesis 1 is mostly about God and purpose and function. One can believe any age they want for the earth and still realize that the passage is primarily theological. The problem is that once you start saying that it is anything other than historical narrative, you're taking away some of the arguments that people use for a young earth, and they see that as an attack. But it shouldn't really be viewed that way.
Well, I think there's an overemphasis on Genesis 1 from a young earth perspective that focuses, I wouldn't not just say primarily, but almost completely on the material.
Right.
That Genesis 1 is almost like a Google Calendar of God's creative acts.
Right.
And I think, John Walton has brought these ideas about a functional ontology to the forefront of evangelical thought. And it's not that, John is teaching something new. It was new to me. It was new to you. It's new to the evangelical world, but it certainly wasn't new in the scholarly world.
Right.
Of ancient Near Eastern studies. And, John would say in his books, he's got a whole series of The Lost World of,
right,
that University Press puts out. And he seems to try to mitigate that battle between creation and evolution by saying, there's another way to read Genesis 1 that allows that functional ontology to come to the forefront.
Right.
I do think, though, that John overemphasizes the functional piece just a bit. And, he and I dialogued for a little bit on my blog about a decade ago. And, I was critiquing some of his ideas, and he couldn't quite understand why I was doing that. But, for him, as you go through the creation account, there's on the second day, God creates the firmament.
Right.
And at least from the ancient Near East perspective, that firmament was a solid dome. And John would say, well, that solid dome doesn't actually exist. You can't, get a ladder high enough and grab a piece of the firmament, break it up and put it in your pocket. Therefore, the chapter's focus can't be on the material. So it's really all about functional ontology, not material ontology. And I would kind of push back on that a little bit and say, well, Genesis 1 account is about the creation of the material. And through the ancient Near Eastern Hebrew eyes, that firmament was material.
Right.
The very word, rachia, meaning something that's beaten or hammered out, is testament to that. This was something that was solid, tangible.
Right.
And
the way they understood it was wrong.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that the item itself or what they were talking about doesn't really exist.
So the firmament doesn't exist in the way that the Bible describes it, but because the material was not the focus of the chapter.
Right.
It wasn't meant to teach the existence of the firmament. It was meant to teach that God's creation was purposeful.
Right.
That's what Genesis 1 was meant to teach. And John Walton does a great job of explaining that. But at the same time that he tries to teach us this ancient Near Eastern worldview, I think sometimes he backs off a little bit, and sometimes his Enlightenment-influenced Western worldview kind of creeps in, and he almost takes the bait every once in a while. But I don't fault him too much about that.
One of the other things that, to me, and it's just something that I've noticed that I haven't heard anybody else point out, so maybe there's a valid reason
The reception
for that.
here is a little spotty. I'm not able to hear the question.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. One of the things that I had noticed and I pointed out in my book is that from a theological perspective, it's also about God's sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in the way when God separates the darkness from the light, he names it, the daytime and the nighttime is day and night, and he separates the waters from the earth, and he names it earth and seas.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be real clear as we go through the rest of Genesis, that earth is not a planet that is 3/4 water. Earth is dry land surrounded by water, But when you get into Genesis 2 and Adam and the animals, Adam is given dominion over the animals, and Adam names the animals.
Right.
And that naming shows sovereignty over something, and is often tied to a new purpose. You see it where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all given new names by their captors. Mm-hmm. They were under somebody else's dominion at the time.
Right.
And you see it when God gives Abram the new name Abraham, mm-hmm. or when Christ, renamed Simon to Peter and things like that. People were given new names or even given names before they were born. Your name shall be such and such, designating a certain purpose or function that they were going, that they were being set apart for. And I think that is something that in the ancient culture, they would have understood a lot more than we do today. And so when they saw, God named some things, Adam named some things, that would have made, a theological point to them mm-hmm. that we often miss.
You're right. And that ability, or I guess the responsibility that God gave Adam to name the animals, is essentially a transference of authority.
Right.
And we see that authority given to mankind in Genesis 1 on that sixth day.
Right.
And, given the commission to multiply and replenish the earth and to have authority and dominion over it.
Right.
And hopefully we do that in a responsible way.
I think that's part of us being in God's image, or being his image bearer.
Absolutely.
Being his representative. We have been given delegated powers, as it were, to do certain things.
I always like to say that the image of God is conferred upon us. It is not something that we just are.
Right.
If you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, or even a young Earth creationist de novo creation perspective, it's not our creativity, it's not our moral awareness, it's not our intelligence, it's not our opposable thumbs or anything like that gives us the right to be, but they make our ability to reflect God's authority, to serve as his representatives, possible. So all the things that make human beings unique and special on this earth aren't the image, but they make us bearing the image possible.
Right.
But it is something that is conferred upon us by virtue of our capabilities.
Just like God's natural laws that he created allow him to do the creating that he's doing, our natural abilities and natural, having hands and feet to go where he wants us to, and hands to do what he wants us to do, a mind to think the way that he wants us to. These are all natural things that we have, but they have divine significance, divine purpose. We have them for a reason.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Jumping into the cosmic temple idea, why don't you explain that a little bit and how the ancient audience would have understood that based on how Genesis 1 is laid out?
Yeah. Well, a lot of these ideas I've gotten from John Walton, supplemented by a good friend of mine, Denny Lamoureux. He's a professor of science and religion up in Alberta. And
he's got some great online classes I'll have to link to.
He does. He's got excellent online classes, and I had the chance to spend some time with him at Wheaton College this summer at the American Scientific Affiliation's annual meeting. He's just got such a pastoral heart and loves to, bring out some of Walton's material and interspersing that into his own. And it really is a highlight to understand that Genesis 1 really is a temple creation account. And I think this is why John Walton downplays the material aspect of Genesis 1. And I think rightly so, because this is not a Google Calendar of God's creative acts. There's a lot of literary structure to this, and it's a very purposeful structure. You can get into the ontology and teleology of Genesis 1 itself.
Right.
And, how was it created? And there's a lot of debate about when Genesis 1 was written. And I tend to think that it was actually the later creation account of between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3. With 2 and 3 being written in a period of Israel's history that was more agrarian in nature, whereas Genesis 1, I think, was written either during, and at least an oral tradition of it had occurred during Israel's exile in Babylon, and probably written and redacted in the post-exilic period when they were rebuilding their own temple at the behest of King Cyrus of Persia. And it does reflect other chronologically earlier texts produced by Israel's neighbors in Sumer and Ugarit and Egypt. And some of these texts describe temple dedications or temple construction, and they share the same kind of 7-day structure. And the first 3 days is all about the creation of that outer structure. Yahweh fashions the cosmos from the state of non-order over the course of these 7-day periods in that first 3 days for the creation of the things that were important to the Hebrews. You've got the creation of light, otherwise known as day. There's God naming that particular aspect of creation and separating it from the darkness. And that's time in John Walton's paradigm. Right. The second day is the creation of this solid firmament, the separation of the waters above from the waters below. John equates this to weather. This is atmosphere. This is tides. Day 3 is the creation of land and vegetation, otherwise known as agriculture. So time and weather and agriculture, all important to these agrarian societies. And then these are what John calls the functions. And this is how the world functions, using this outer structure. And what fills this outer structure are the internal objects. And that's the second period of 3 days. On day 4, you have the sun, moon, and the stars created that fill what was created in day 1. And then the sun, moon, and stars, what is the teleology? The purpose was for marking days, seasons, years. On day 5, you've got fish and the sea monsters created, and the birds. The seas would produce fish, and the skies would be populated by birds. On the third day of that second 3-day set, day 6, land animals and mankind were created to populate the land. And these are what John calls the functionaries. And so these functionaries play certain roles in essentially the upkeep of the structure. See, the sun, moon, and stars, they rule the day and the night. The fish rule the sea. The birds rule the air. Mankind rules the land.
Yeah, so back to the temple analogy, the first 3 days are creating the physical structure, and the next 3 days are moving in all of the objects that represent the different areas and are the purpose of the different areas. Is that
being facetious? But we are tools for the upkeep of his temple. And if the entire cosmos is viewed as just one ginormous temple, and Isaiah speaks of heaven as being God's throne and earth being God's footstool, and we are priests within this cosmic temple. I mean, just the whole temple imagery is just shouting out of Genesis 1. And I think there is nothing better that demonstrates that than what happens on day 7 after he's finished his creative acts. He rests, and it's not because he was tired, but as a king, as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, he sits down in his temple, and once you sit on that throne, I mean, you've been enthroned and you can begin to rule.
Right.
And there is a sense in which, and I think Hebrews 4 bears this out, is that, the people of God, when they are seen as God's people and we recognize ourselves as his priests and we enter his rest, it's not a rest from our labors. We become co-heirs and co-rulers with him.
Right.
And so that divine dominion that day 7 speaks of, we participate in that. And I think in the Exodus, where God says, you will work for 6 days and you will rest on the 7th because I created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. That day 7, I would hate to think that it's just doing nothing. I would think that that's the day that you begin to enjoy the fruits of your labor.
Right.
And you are able to enjoy the children you've created. And you enjoy the home you've created. I mean, these are things, and you're actually in the act of, I think, ruling more in that day of rest than you are, the other 6 days.
Yeah, it's the purpose of the 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
All of the things that you do for those, it's like, you work and a bunch of overtime and stuff so that you can take time off to go on vacation.
Yeah.
And it's the vacation that is a time for you to relax, a time for you to focus on the important things, but it's the time away from work.
Mm-hmm.
It's the time with family and the time at church and the time in fellowship and that kind of stuff. That is the reason why we do all of the work. And that was something that struck me when I was studying Genesis 1, was that so many people look at it as 6 days of creation and don't think of the 7th day as anything more than, that's that little bit before you get back into day 6 and it talks about Adam.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way most people think of it. But I'm thinking it's building up to day 7.
Mm-hmm.
We can't forget day 7 because that's the pinnacle. We kind of start down at the deep, with the Spirit hovering over the deep, and we're kind of working our way up a little bit with the light and dark, and then the firmament on day 3. We're kind of working our way up in a, if you were to think of this in their cosmology, working our way back up higher and higher, and God's throne is above that firmament. And then when you start feeling it, you kind of feel it almost top down, back down to man. But then you finish it off with day 7, with God coming to rest. So he's like bracketed on both sides of this,
Ooh, and like that.
Yeah.
He's the bookend. He is the Alpha and the Omega.
Right.
So
right.
and that day 7, I mean that's just a the Ugaritic and Akkadian texts that have these similar temple construction and dedications. They also feature a period of divine rest. And their God ceases their creative activity and they begin to rule over what they created. So all of these other texts out there, we should be using these to better inform our own reading of Genesis.
Right.
There are way too many similarities for folks to dismiss reading Genesis 1 that way. And it's not an issue of, Israel stole from other cultures. I don't think there's any way you could prove that. But what you can prove is that they had this common cognitive environment in which they lived and they wrote literature and they worshiped their god or gods. And so there was a whole slew of ideas that were very similar across that region.
They told stories and taught things in the same way.
Yeah.
So it's just natural that they would pick up the same kind of patterns. I know in the temple, I think it was Solomon's temple that David designed and Solomon built. It was like 7 days of or 7 years of construction, followed by 7 days of dedication before God came to rest down in the temple. I actually even was reading some stuff today about the tabernacle, and this would have been very immediate cultural context for Moses, because they're wandering through the desert, putting up this tabernacle every time they stop. But the orientation of the tabernacle being east-west correlated with the angel being placed at the entrance to Eden that was to the east of Eden.
Right.
And so the very orientation of the tabernacle, before you even get into what all it may have contained and everything, all points to this correlation with the Genesis 1 story.
Right. And so, you've got Eden serving as a microcosm of the universe. So kind of to backtrack, in the ancient Near East, you've got these images of gods, these idols that are placed in temples and homes and important village locales like the gate to the city that mark the extent of a particular god's authority. And those idols were physical representations of divine authority, right? So for the Hebrews, the creation of human beings marked this assignment of priestly functions to mankind. So God's commissioned them to serve as representatives and wielders of his authority. Now, if the priests go bad, God's going to, get rid of those priests. He's going to exile them. Right. Which is kind of a sad story. But I think your connection with the entrance of the temple being on the east side, and the angel being put at the east entrance of Eden is spot on. And but what's interesting is that you've got in the 6th day of Genesis 1, God giving all of mankind these priestly functions, and he kind of democratizes the idea of the image. Whereas in Babylonian and Egyptian cultures, the only ones that served as the image were the pharaohs or the kings, and the aristocracy, the priestly class, were the ones that wielded the authority of the king or the king on God's behalf. But the Hebrew account, it's not just a temple. It's not just a physical temple. It's the entire cosmos. And what that does is that leaves no room for competition. There is zero room for competition. So all of these other gods out there, the Hebrew account is a polemic against the existence of those gods. It's a uniquely Hebrew theological polemic. Right. Against their neighbors. And the creation account is couched in that Hebrew theology in terms that the Jewish people could understand. And I think their neighbors could also understand what was being done here. Right. It wasn't just written for the Jews. It was written for everybody.
And then when Christ comes a couple thousand years after this, he expands it even further, where we become his temple.
Yes.
The church becomes his temple. And as we spread everywhere, we are basically spreading divine little temples everywhere. It's like,
yeah. Well, even Israel itself was a microcosm. In Isaiah 51, chapter 16, God says, I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. So when he creates a people, he's using this creation language of establishing heavens and laying foundations.
Right.
And you can actually see decreation language being used in a very similar way when God sends his judgment upon Israel and Judea and Egypt and Edom and Babylon, that these countries, when they're being destroyed by these foreign armies, it talks about, the sun going dark, the moon turning to blood, the stars falling from the sky, this creation language. Their people were being destroyed and their temples were being destroyed. So there's this whole microcosm motif running through Israel's history. You start with Eden, then you go to the Mosaic tabernacle, you go to the Davidic Solomonic temple, you go to the Herodian temple, and then you go to Jesus, who says, to the Pharisees, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days.
Yep.
And so Jesus now has become the microcosmic intersection of heaven and earth. And then when we become part of the body of Christ, we take on that same microcosmic flavor, that we become temples. We become this intersection of heaven and earth in which we don't need something physical in order to interact and commune with God. What's interesting is that, the temple being so prominent and central in the Mosaic system, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, who is not a contemporary of Christ. He was born probably maybe 6 or 7 years after Jesus had ascended. He wrote a book called The Antiquity of the Jews. And this was after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Romans. And in his account, he reveals that the designs of the Mosaic tabernacle and the temples reflected this whole cosmic temple concept. And because the tabernacle and the temple complex was this intersection of heaven and earth, Josephus describes certain portions of the tabernacle and the temple in those very same terms. And let me read something, just a quick passage from Antiquities of the Jews. Let me see if I can find okay, so the reference would be in Book 3, Chapter 6, Section 4. It says, this proportion of the measures of the tabernacle proved to be an imitation of the system of the world. For the third part thereof, which was within the 4 pillars, to which the priests were not admitted, this is the Holy of Holies, as it were, a heaven peculiar to God, but the space of the 20 cubits as it were, sea and land on which men live. So this part is peculiar to the priests only. And then going to Book 3, Chapter 7, Section 7, Josephus says, consider the fabric of the tabernacle. Look upon these things, and he will find that they were every one made in way of imitation and representation of the universe. When Moses distinguished the tabernacle into 3 parts and allowed 2 of them to the priests as a place accessible and common, he denoted the land and the sea, these being the general access to all. But he set apart the 3rd division for God because heaven is inaccessible to men. And then going to Book 5, Chapter 5, Section 4, he talks about the veil in the temple. It was a Babylonian curtain, he writes, embroidered with blue and fine linen and scarlet and purple, and of a contexture that was truly wonderful. Nor was this mixture of colors without its mystical interpretation, but was a kind of image of the universe. So a lot of cosmic temple imagery in the description. And
they come right, and he comes right out and says, this is the way this is understood.
Yep.
And we just totally missed that when we turned it into a debate over how old the dirt is.
Right.
Which is sad, because there's so much richness and theology and cool stuff in here. If we just take our blinders off and take our rose-colored glasses off of, all the things that we've been taught when it comes to young Earth, old Earth debates or a polemic against evolution or whatever, and read it the way they would have.
You miss it when you're reading it from a young Earth perspective. You miss all that imagery. You miss, I think you miss certain extremely important aspects of ontology and teleology. The purpose of the Earth, I think, it's much more beautiful when understood from an ancient Near Eastern perspective than from a purely scientific mindset.
So let me ask you a question. Do you believe Genesis 1 is telling the creation story in the context of a temple story? Or do you believe that Genesis 1 took place as the pattern for temple stories or temple constructions?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think it's both. Because in order for heaven and earth to be used as imagery, to serve as a metaphor, you have to have an initial creative act that provides a prologue for other creative acts to follow. So I think Genesis 1 is speaking of a material creation, but it is couched in very specific temple language. And I think that's what John Walton really hammers away at. And but again, to use that metaphor of heavens and earth in other fashions, it has to have something on which all that is based. It has to be rooted in something tangible and an experienced reality for the phrase to possess any additional meaning beyond the literal. So without the literal object with which to provide a foundational basis for the metaphor would lack meaning.
Right.
And so, my study of all this, I have to begin with a reasonable assumption that Genesis 1 describes the creation of the physical cosmos. Now, I think it's not beyond God to allow for additional layers of meaning to come out of that account. And I know Pete Enns, who I got to spend some time with earlier this spring, he tends to think of Genesis 1 as describing more the creation of the promised land of Israel rather than the material creation. And he's got a great book out called, is it The Evolution of Adam? Which is, I think, kind of deceiving because it's really not about Adam's physical evolution. It's about the use of Adam throughout biblical literature and also extra-biblical literature in the Jewish tradition. And so I think that answers your question, that I think Genesis 1 is a material creation account written and couched in cosmic temple language with an extremely heavy focus on functional ontology and not a material ontology.
And because it was seen as God coming to rest and God resides in temples, and Eden being seen as where heaven and earth kind of overlap, future temple construction and future temple ceremonies followed that same pattern.
Yeah, Daniel, if you don't mind me asking, what year were you born?
1962.
Okay, so 1962. That was the year that the Daniel Eaton Temple was created.
It didn't become one until 1967.
God didn't enter the temple. God didn't enter the temple until then.
Right.
But your body is a temple. And there is so much you can draw out of Genesis 1 in those terms, but I think especially more so in Genesis 2 and 3 with the account of Adam and Eve. That, and I'm of the opinion that Adam and Eve are more literary archetypes rather than historical personages. I leave room for that possibility, that like John Walton would say, that he believes that Adam and Eve were historical people. They didn't say the things they did or act the way they did necessarily in the way that the Bible says they did, but I think he believes that they were real people. But I think the account lends itself more to describing every person, that you are Adam and I am Eve, And we all go through this same process of being, we start out in this moral innocence. And
Right.
you look at your kids and your grandkids and you see them running around naked as toddlers, and they don't care. They're innocent. It means nothing to
Right.
them. But then they develop this moral awareness, and things kind of shift a little bit in their
Right.
perspective, and they become more self-conscious and maybe morally aware. And eventually they break the law. They break the rules. They disobey what mom and dad are saying to them.
Right.
And we see Adam and Eve's story being played out in the lives of every child that is ever born and, God willing, lives to an age in which they can rebel against the very God who created them.
You see it in Israel as a nation as well.
Absolutely. And Pete Enns bears this out as well, that Israel's reflected in this. They start off innocent, the Abrahamic covenant, and then eventually they get a set of rules, and they break them.
Over and over.
And they're exiled. They're exiled to Assyria. They're exiled to Babylon. They're exiled after the Romans destroy the temple. They're the diaspora. And it's time and time again the story of Adam and Eve comes alive, not just in terms of Israel, but in terms of every person that's ever lived. And I like to say that when I'm pressed on the point of whether I believe Adam and Eve are historical, I usually look at them and I say, well, I'll pinch myself. Yeah, I feel pretty real. I think I'm an integral part of the history of this cosmos. Yeah, Adam and Eve certainly are historical. It doesn't get any more real than that.
Yeah, the genealogies have me convinced that there was a real couple there. I don't believe that their names were Adam and Eve because I don't think that they spoke Hebrew. I think that,
You're right. Adam and
so their names came later. A lot of the things said about them, I believe, are archetypal and are more figurative than a lot of us generally take it. So it's not an either or thing. I tend to think that they were a lot more normal than we give them credit for.
Yeah, the genealogies, I think, are one of the toughest aspects to explain from an evolutionary creationist perspective. But I do like to think that, at least insofar as the genealogies are concerned and the names, that you get to Seth, and that's as far as the Hebrew ancestral memory goes.
Right.
And they can't go any farther. And they assume that, there must have been an original pair. Let's just use the archetypal names of Adam and Eve,
right?
To kind of put a period at the end of that genealogy.
Yeah, that's the first time I'd heard that they only go back as far as Seth.
Well, I'm totally speculating that maybe the reason why the names suddenly become archetypal with Adam and Eve is that the ancestral memories only go so far. That's as far as the genealogies were able to go before they've been lost in time. And so they create the biblical Adam and Eve names in order to give the genealogy some closure.
Yeah, I guess the argument I would make against that is that they give some ages to Adam and, so that's why I think that there was some real person that they were talking about there.
The ages are a whole nother discussion about whether they were real or whether they were symbolic.
I've got an episode scheduled to discuss that.
Nice.
But I don't have a guest lined up for that episode. Are you interested?
I am not interested, but I know someone who might. She is
okay. Well, shoot me an email and let me know, because that is a very interesting discussion, and I don't know as much about it as I would like in order to just wing it solo. So it would be great to have a guest on that could discuss that further in the future when we on the podcast here get into discussion of theistic evolution.
Yeah,
I'd love to have you back to discuss why you became convinced in that. Out of young earth creationism and, your whole journey in that, and even some of the some of the things that you brought up in your BioLogos series and, the things you had to overcome in order to get to where you are now. That won't be for a few weeks, maybe even first of the year, whatever. But I'd love to have you back to discuss that if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mike, it's been great to have you on again. We didn't mention it in this podcast, but this is a redo because it has taken us about, 2.5 or 3 weeks to do this between scheduling conflicts and me being sick and then recording it. It didn't record and everything. So it's been a hassle to put this one in the books, but I really appreciate your patience and coming back on and discussing this and the opportunity to talk face to face with you for a while.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure, Daniel.
I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
Okay.
Again.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mike Beidler. I'm really looking forward to having him back at least 1 or 2 more times. Speaking of that, I have, I think, 45 or 46 additional episodes scheduled so far in the podcast. Next week, I plan on getting into, or next episode rather, I plan on getting into some of the worldview challenges that we face today and how we approach Genesis 1. And then after that, we'll be getting into the different interpretations of Genesis that I've studied. And we'll be having several guests on over the course of the next several episodes. I think I've got about 10 or so of the remaining 45 episodes that I currently have laid out that we'll be having special guests on. So those will include having Mike back on. It'll also include having Brian Godawa back on. I've got Michael Heiser scheduled for a episode, and I have a couple different professors and scientists and stuff coming in to discuss a few things. So that will all be coming up in the future. So make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you can get those episodes. I have, unfortunately, though, been suffering some health issues in the last couple of weeks. That's why this episode has taken almost 3 weeks to get out. And so I probably will be fulfilling the warning that I gave in the introduction to the podcast, where I said that the episodes will be infrequent. They will be coming out as my health allows, but I'm not going to endanger my health just to make some episode schedule that I'm forcing on myself. So I will be doing these as I have the opportunity and putting them out. But like I said, don't expect them to fit an exact weekly schedule unless I'm physically up to that. As usual, I hope that you check out all of the show notes attached to this episode. I'll be putting links to different things that Mike has written and different things, a YouTube video, for example, where he gave a talk at a church that was on this topic of his journey to theistic evolution. I will also be putting some links to the online course that I'd mentioned from Dennis Lamoureux. It's a introduction basically into evolutionary biology from a guy that has actually got 3 doctorates, 3 earned doctorates, and is actually an expert in dinosaur teeth, which I thought was really cool. I actually have a dinosaur fossil of a jaw that I sent him pictures of to get him to ID for me one time. But he's a really good guy, and he has a lot of really good free online resources if you're interested in learning why a Christian could believe in biology and exactly what the evidences are that can lead a Christian to that conclusion. So I'll put a link to that in there, and who knows, I may even contact him and see if he can come on as a guest sometime. But until the next episode, I want to thank you again for listening to Creation and Conflict Podcast, where our goal is to turn confrontation into conversation. Thanks again.